September 3, 1973, Hong Kong. The coroner's inquest, Day 2. The lawyer representing the interests of Golden Harvest asked the question in a way that was careful enough to suggest it had been rehearsed. Not the question itself, the angle of it. The specific framing that would allow the answer to land without opening the larger question that the answer implied. He asked about the medication. He asked about its properties. He asked about the documented sensitivity reaction. He did not ask, and the presiding officer did not ask, and no one in that room on that specific afternoon asked, the question that was sitting in the middle of all the other questions, like a weight that everyone could feel, and no one was willing to pick up. The medication found in Bruce Lee's system at the time of his death had not been prescribed to him. That fact was in the record. It had been established during the first day of proceedings. It was not disputed. The equagesic, the painkiller containing meprobamate that the inquest would conclude had caused the fatal hypersensitivity reaction, belonged to Betty Ting Pei. Her prescription, her bottle, given to Bruce Lee that afternoon for a headache that he had mentioned when he arrived at her apartment on Cumberland Road. The official record treated this as context, as background, as the mechanism by which the medication entered his body, relevant to cause but not to anything that required further examination. The inquest moved forward. The verdict arrived. Death by misadventure. The proceedings closed. And the question that nobody asked in that room on September 3, 1973, has been sitting unanswered in the record ever since. Not the question of what killed him. The official cause has not been seriously challenged at the level of basic mechanism. The question underneath that one, the one about what it means that the medication was not his, whose decision it was to give it, what was known by whom about his medical history and its relationship to that specific compound, and whether the word misadventure, with its implication of accident, of randomness, of the purely unforeseeable, fully accounts for what the evidence examined completely actually shows. This is the investigation, not into conspiracy, into the gap between what was established and what was examined. Those are different things, and the distance between them, in this case, is larger than 50 years of official narrative has made it appear. Bruce Lee died on July 20, 1973. He was 32 years old, 5 feet 7 inches, 135 pounds, or close to it, though the people who were around him in the weeks following the Enter the Dragon production wrap had noted that he was carrying less weight than usual, the specific kind of less that sits differently on a trained body than ordinary thinness does. The Enter the Dragon shoot had run from January through March of that year. The first major Hollywood-Hong Kong co-production, Warner Brothers infrastructure grafted onto Golden Harvest's Hammer Hill Road studios in Kowloon, concrete block sound stages that held the heat, Cantonese and English mixing in every corridor, the harbor smell of salt and diesel finding its way in from the water. The pressure of that production had been the pressure of a proof of concept for something an entire industry had said was impossible, and Bruce Lee had carried it in the way he carried everything, completely without visible strain, in a manner that made it difficult for the people around him to locate the line between him operating at full capacity and him operating beyond it. By July, he had been in post-production discussions, development meetings, the administrative machinery that follows a major shoot. He had projects in various stages. He had the specific forward momentum of a man who can finally see the thing he has spent his entire adult life building beginning to arrive. Enter the Dragon was not yet released. It would open on August 19th, 4 weeks after he was gone. He never saw it. On the afternoon of July 20th, he arrived at the apartment on Cumberland Road. A meeting about a film project. He mentioned a headache. He was given equagesic. He went to lie down. He was found unresponsive. He was taken to Queen Elizabeth Hospital and pronounced dead. The meprobamate in the equagesic caused cerebral edema. The cerebral edema killed him. This is what the inquest established and what the medical evidence supported. What the inquest did not establish, what it was not structured to establish, or was not pressed to establish, was the complete picture of what Bruce Lee's medical history said about his relationship to compounds in the meprobamate family, who had access to that history, and what a person with that access would have understood about the risk involved in giving him that specific medication for a headache on that specific afternoon. The Hong Kong film industry in 1971 to 1973 was not an environment built around documentation of personal medical history. Golden Harvest had broken from the Shaw Brothers infrastructure only a few years earlier, creating an industry running on speed and personal relationship and the hunger of an operation, proving itself against the established order. The people who worked in proximity to Bruce Lee, who managed his schedule, arranged his meetings, handled the practical details of his professional life, operated in a world where information moved through personal networks rather than formal records. What was known about his health was known informally, and informal knowledge is, by definition, not uniformly distributed. Different people in proximity to him knew different things. The question of what Betty Ting Pei knew about his medical history when she gave him the equagesic is the question that the inquest, for reasons the record does not fully explain, did not pursue past the point of establishing that the medication was hers and that she gave it to him. I want to stop here and tell you something about where I am in relation to this material, because I owe you that honesty. When I started looking into this story, the specific story of the medication, its provenance, the gap in what the inquest examined, my expectation was that I would find either clear evidence of something being deliberately overlooked or clear evidence that the official account was complete and the gap was illusory. What I found instead was neither of those things. What I found was a situation of genuine complexity, a set of facts that are verifiable, arranged in a pattern that raises a real question, surrounded by an absence of documentation that makes the question impossible to resolve definitively. That absence is not itself evidence of concealment. It is, in part, simply what 1973 Hong Kong looks like from the outside 50 years later. But it is also not nothing. And the specific shape of what is absent, the specific questions that were not asked in a proceeding that was structured in ways that made not asking them easier than asking them would have been, is where the story actually lives. Meprobamate, the active compound in the relevant component of equagesic, belongs to a class of sedative agents that were in common use in this era for anxiety and muscle relaxation as well as pain management. Sensitivity reactions to compounds in this class were documented in the medical literature of the period. They were not well understood at the level of predicting which individuals carried elevated risk. The pharmacological picture was less complete in 1973 than it would later become. But what was understood was that prior exposure to related compounds, combined with certain physiological conditions, could significantly increase the probability of an adverse response. Bruce Lee's medical history in the years before July 1973 included the 1970 back injury, partial sacral nerve damage from a barbell exercise, months bedridden, treatment that by multiple accounts involved medication management of pain and inflammation during the recovery period. The specific compounds used in that treatment and what they may have established in terms of his body's responses to related agents is a question that the available record does not answer. What the available record shows is that his treatment during the recovery period was managed by doctors, that it was documented in the form that medical treatment is documented, and that those records were not, as far as any account I have found indicates, entered into the inquest proceedings as relevant context for evaluating whether the medication reaction was foreseeable, whether they were requested and not produced, whether they were not requested because the question of foreseeability was not being asked, whether the people who had access to his medical history, his own physicians, his wife Linda, who was aware of his medical situation, the people managing his professional life, who would have had practical reasons to understand the health of their most valuable asset, communicated any of that history to the people conducting the inquest. These are the questions that the record does not answer because the record does not show they were asked. Here is where I have to be straight with you about what the available sources can and cannot establish, because the line matters, and I am not going to pretend it doesn't. What I can tell you with confidence, the medication was not his, it was given to him by someone else. The inquest established this and treated it as context rather than as a line of inquiry. The question of what was known about his medical history in relation to that specific compound was not pursued in any form that entered the official record. What I cannot tell you, whether the person who gave him the medication had any knowledge that created a specific duty to understand the risk, whether anyone present that afternoon had information that would have changed the decision to give him Equagesic, whether the inquest's failure to pursue these questions was a structural limitation, a judgment call, or something shaped by the interests of the people and institutions that surrounded the proceedings. The honest answer is that I do not know. The record is incomplete in ways that make the complete answer unreachable from the outside. What the investigation can reach is the shape of what surrounds the gap, and that shape is worth examining carefully. The September inquest was conducted under significant pressure of a specific kind. Bruce Lee was not a private individual whose death needed to be resolved quietly. He was the center of a commercial machinery that had just completed its most significant project and was weeks away from releasing it into the world. Enter the Dragon existed. The Warner Brothers relationship existed. The entire commercial argument that an Asian man could anchor a major American production. An argument Bruce Lee had spent his career making against the specific and sustained institutional resistance of a Hollywood that categorically refused to cast Asian actors in leading roles, that had taken the television series concept he had helped develop and given the lead to a white actor while he watched. That argument was 4 weeks away from being proven in the most public way possible. The people with stakes in that outcome were not passive observers of the inquest proceedings. This is not an accusation. It is a description of the environment in which the proceedings occurred. Inquests are not conducted in isolation from the worlds that surround them, and the 1973 Hong Kong coroner system was not equipped to insulate itself from commercial and social pressure in the way that a fully independent investigation might have been. The questions that were asked and the questions that were not asked reflect, at least in part, the environment in which the asking happened. There's something I want to put to you here, because it's been sitting with me throughout this research and I can't find a clean resolution to it on my own. The medication not being his, that fact, sitting where it sits in the official record, treated as background rather than as a line of inquiry, is either the most important overlooked detail in the entire story of Bruce Lee's death, or it is exactly what the inquest treated it as: context, relevant to mechanism, irrelevant to the question of whether the death could have been prevented by any reasonable action any person present could have taken. Those two readings produce completely different understandings of what happened on July 20th, 1973. I have read the available record as carefully as I can, and I genuinely cannot determine which reading the evidence supports. I want to know which one lands as true for you, because I think you might see something in it that I'm too close to this material to see clearly. Tell me in the comments. I mean that specifically, not about the story as a whole, about this one fact and what you make of it. The verdict of death by misadventure has stood for 50 years. Misadventure. A death resulting from a legal act performed without negligence or intent to harm, where an unforeseeable accident occurs. The word carries a specific legal and moral weight. It says no one is responsible. It says this could not have been anticipated. It says the accident was genuine. What the word requires to be accurate is that the foreseeable risk was not foreseeable, that the person who gave him the medication had no reasonable basis to know that this specific compound given to this specific person in this specific physiological condition carried an elevated probability of the outcome that occurred. Whether that is true depends on what was known, and what was known depends on what was communicated, and what was communicated depends on what the people around Bruce Lee understood about his medical history and chose to share or not share with each other in the months and weeks before July 20th. That chain, from knowledge to communication to the single act of handing someone a painkiller for a headache, is the chain the inquest did not follow. Whether it leads somewhere that would have changed the verdict, or whether it leads to a genuine dead end where the accident was exactly as unforeseeable as the official record says it was, is the question that 50 years has not answered. Bruce Lee had written about the relationship between fear and limitation, the idea that the dread of pain, the flinching away from what is difficult to face, is the thing that prevents development in every domain it touches. He applied this to physical training, to philosophical inquiry, to the sustained effort of making himself into someone the world could not ignore. He meant it as instruction for the living, as a way of moving through the world that honored what you were capable of if you were willing to face it fully. There is a version of what happened on July 20th, 1973, in which the failure was exactly this: a flinching away. Not by Bruce Lee, by the system surrounding his death. A system that, when it encountered a question that was difficult to face, about what was known, about what should have been known, about the specific chain of decisions that ended with a man who had built himself into something extraordinary lying down for a headache and not waking up, found it easier to call it misadventure than to follow the chain to wherever it led. The medication was not prescribed to him. It was given to him by someone else. The question of what that person knew and what the people around them knew, and whether the death was as genuinely unforeseeable as the official record requires it to have been. That question was present in the inquest proceedings on September 3, 1973. It was not asked. And in the 50 years since, in the enormous body of investigation and speculation and documentary and biography that has grown up around Bruce Lee's death, it has remained with remarkable consistency the question that does not quite get asked all the way to the end. The weight is still there, in the middle of the record, waiting.